And we are now recording, and this is our Bible study for March 26th, 2023. And we are um, we are hopeful that we'll get through the rest of Genesis 4 today. And I really would like to get to Methuselah. Methuselah is I like to study Methuselah. We'll just say it that way. But as you can see here, we had gotten down through to this verse, verse 18, and talking about the descendants of Cain. And you remember Cain, first descendant in the line, Enoch. This is not the Enoch we've talked about before, seventh from Adam, different Enoch. And so Enoch is the first, then Irad is second. Irad begat Mehujael or Mehujael. And by the way, these names, Irad, Mehujael, Methusael, it's difficult to know exactly what they mean. And Lamech as well. His name was not Lamech. That is the words in pause at the end of a verse. So they lengthened the vowel on the first syllable. But so you can see Enoch was the first, then Irad, then Mehujael, Methusael, and then Lamech. So Lamech is the fifth from Cain. So his grandfather, 5 generations down, is Cain. So, and I'll use that terminology in that respect. But notice too, then, and Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other, Zillah. And again, we can conjecture on the meaning of the names, but let me just tell you, you've got to be careful what you find in the lexicons, because the lexicons are almost always, as a matter of fact, quite honestly, I do not know of a lexicon that is not evolutionary in its primary perspective of the scriptures. And thus, what you have is, because they will take the perspective that nothing of the scriptures was written until Moses came along to do the writing. So Moses is the first one. It was all revealed to him and everything. So all of the names were put on to these people essentially by Moses, or at some later time. And that's just simply not true, as we've talked about previously, but so we won't go into that. But because the commentators of the present day and the year since, they'll say the name, well, okay, Ada, we know that Ada is, well, that means such and such, or that Zillah, well, that means such and such. Well, they don't really know. They're taking a later meaning that is somewhat, and believe me, somewhat established, not very well established at all. But they're taking those later concepts of the words, and they're putting those later concepts back on the original concepts, where you only have that usage. You have this name in this place, and that's all you have. They don't have any other information to tell them what the name actually meant. And you keep in mind, we're going to see, I'll tell you in a little bit about that, but you keep in mind, the children are not named after 30 or 40 or 50 years of life. Children are named at birth, and they were named at birth from the time of Adam. They weren't named after you figured out what they do. That's why people would say, well, you know, the name Abel, well, that just means he's like a vapor. He's short-lived. He's not going to live long. And you think, can you imagine how dumb you have to be to think that Adam and Eve named this, who is apparently their second son, and they name Abel Hevel, and they name him, well, he's going to die soon. He's not going to live long. You say, well, they could have known that. God could have revealed it. That's not indicated anywhere in any way to any degree. And to say, well, that's because he was going, do you know it probably, his name was probably given to him because, let's say, Eve's labor may have been very, very short. She may not have had much labor in bearing him at all, or much difficulty, or maybe not having even any morning sickness or anything like that we associate with a child coming into the world. But it was something that they thought of at the time of the birth, not something that they thought was going to happen to him 100 years later. It's, somewhere we got to think rightly about these things. But now the names Mehujael, as we say in Methusael, appear to include the word God, El. You see the El there as part of each. This does not indicate a true godliness on the part of the Canaanite. I should not say Canaanite, Canaanites. And if you'll look up here for just a moment, looking at the text, you can see on the name Mehujael and Methusael, and then you go down to the Hebrew, and you can see, get up there, don't go doing that to me now. You can see, come on, let go of me. You can see the ale on the end of each one of their names. That is the word, and that's a little messy there, but that is the word God, not El. It is not El with a short E. It is Ale with a long E. Sounds like a long A. So the name Ale is in the names of these two individuals here in particular. But let's go back down now to where we were. So this does not indicate a true godliness on the part of the Canaanites, much in the same way that many modern religious groups recognize that God exists. How many people in this day and age use the name God and even would put something about him into the name of their child, but they have no concept of him? So it's done much in the same way that many modern religious groups recognize that God exists, but their perceptions and concepts regarding him are so inaccurate that they actually live and quote unquote worship in total contrast to the design of the true God. Keep in mind, never forget that Cain wanted to worship God. Cain decided to worship God. Cain just decided to worship God according to his human design, his personal human design. And God said, no, there is a way, and that's what, if thou doest well. Remember, we talked about that. There is no such word as well in Hebrew, unless you're talking about a place where there's water down in it and you bore it into the ground, something like that. But this adverb, well, is the word good, and God is the determiner of good, the absolute determiner. There is no good apart from the design of God. So when he says, if thou doest good, wilt thou not be accepted? But if thou doest not good, then there was a sin offering lying at the door. That's another matter. We've already been through that back in Genesis earlier in the chapter. And he would not offer that offering. So that's what we have now. We have people who use the name God. They even make it's a religion about God. They put the name Christ in it. They'll put Jesus in it. They'll do everything else. But their perceptions and concepts regarding him are so inaccurate that they actually live and worship, quote unquote, in total contrast to the design of the true God. In other words, they have God made in their own human image. Just like Voltaire said, in the beginning, God made man in his own image, and now man has returned the favor and made God in his own human image. So that's supposed to be a quote from Voltaire, and I understand it can be found. I am not worried about finding it. I've seen some sources for it, but I just have not taken the time to get it. I don't need quotes from anti-God people. Every human knows that God exists. Every human knows, despite their protests to the contrary. The Creator built this knowledge into them. And if you'd look at Psalm 19, you'd find that out. It cannot be missed by anything in the creation. And then we know, we've heard that, this is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Well, this is the light. God has given the light that lights every person coming into existence. So they all know God, but that doesn't mean that they worship him or interact with him according to his design. So, and nowadays it's there. We know ourselves. So many of us know. You can claim to be a Christian, and we have people all over the place claiming to be Christians, but they don't know Christ accurately, if they know him at all. So now, Lamech, I should say, I changed. This is what happens to me all the time. Lamech defied God's design for monogamy. That is one marriage, if you will. That is one man, one woman, one man, taking two women as wives. Now, what does it mean? Thus indicating his own rejection of the true God, following the example of his grandfather Cain, 5 generations before him. Doubtless, and I don't believe that Lamech was the only one who would have taken 2 wives or more, but he is singled out here specifically. Doubtless Cain was still alive and would live to an age approximating those in the godly line of Adam's descendants. So there's nothing to tell us that, well, Cain was dead, this is 5 generations down, so Cain died. There's nothing to indicate that Cain died. Cain may have lived almost as long as his father Adam. That means he could have lived until the year 1000 absolute. He could have lived beyond the life of his father. We don't know, but we do know that a lot of people were living very long lives in that time. So he was likely still alive. Also, likely Cain was still in the latter part of the prime of his life when Lamech is born, and thus his anti-God influence remained active. If he was alive, and it is very likely that he was, did he suddenly say, oh, we've been wrong. I was wrong. Oh, I need to let's go back and get right with God. There is no evidence of anything like that. And we could go to a New Testament text to reference that as well. But Lamech, as indicated in later verses, was well informed regarding Cain's murder of Abel, as well as Cain's selfish anti-God reason for doing so. Thus, when someone violated that's Lamech's own personal thinking in regard to what was right in his eyes, wow, this sounds a lot like the way America's going nowadays. The Old West, maybe it was. So when someone violated his own personal thinking in regard to what was right in his eyes, that is his own personal view of vengeance, then he, Lamech, executes his own judgment upon the violator. And then the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation, and farther and farther and farther. So the sins of the fathers affect multiple generations after them. It's why it is so important that we seek to walk in the way of God before all those whose lives we touch. Now, no details are given about how marriage was arranged. That's not given in here, but we know God created one man, one woman. A man had his woman, and a woman had her man. In their patriarchal society, a society that seems to have been ruled pretty much by the males, the fathers in the family groups, multiple wives may have been indicative of possessing more power or ability. Now, think about that. We know that men multiplied wives not long after that, and people who were in power multiplied many wives. Even David did so. Solomon made a total mockery of God's design by what he did, and all of that. we see this. We know this kind of thing happened. Now, but it may have been indicative to people that this person has more power or ability because he's got many wives. But that's an anti-God concept that, listen, it sees humans as just other animals that compete for a herd, a harem, to be bred only by the most powerful. You know, you can go over to Cherokee or somewhere, and you can see the elk, and there'll be this big bull who is ruling over his harem. And the other bulls are wishing they were. And that's where we are now. By the way, this is why during the lives of many men who were taken by these powerful kings and these ungodly nations and empires, and they made those men eunuchs, men who could not have physical relations with any of the women in the harem. It was a way of protecting the women who belonged to them, that they could use anytime they wanted. But it's not just men that are the problem. If you look around a little bit, this attitude continues in the women who seek to bear children by the best athletes, the strongest rulers, the richest men, etc. There are women who are out there seeking to have children by these people that they think are going to give them a child that they're really going to be proud of or something like that. And they don't care. They don't care about God's design. And the men in those positions are only too happy to encourage this ungodly perspective. So keep in mind, this is an evidence, you know, the fact that, well, it doesn't say he took 40 wives or 400 wives. It says he took 2. Taking 2 was just as much a violation of the design of God as would be the taking of 40 or 400. It was a violation of the one man, one woman design of the Creator, the perfect design. So now let's go down a little bit more. So then we have here Adah ber Jabal. We say Jabal, Yabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents. So he dwelt in tents, and of such as have cattle. Notice the words of such as have. That's all italicized. And we'll see that in just a minute when we get down below. His brother's name was Yuval. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. That's kind of interesting. In brass and iron, that's not possible because the Iron Age did not come until sometime really after the time of Abraham. So how could he be an artificer in brass and iron? Well, maybe this stuff about we have the, let's see, the archaeologists tell us, let's see, there was the old Stone Age where all they had was stone tools and stone this and stone that. That was all they had. And then they had the later part of the Stone Age, and then they had the Bronze Age. They started using bronze or brass, if you will, but the Bronze Age. And then they progressed, and humans finally started using iron because then they learned how to melt the iron and get the metal out of the rocks and things like that. So then they had an Iron Age, and then we came into, and I don't even know what our age is now. I guess we're modern. We're the top of the heap according to the evolutionary. We'll just leave the word off there. So Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So, and we'll go down. Let's go now. Note, I put this point in here in the text that the lexical meanings of some names are evolutionary in nature because the supposed meanings are built from the lifestyle or the practice of the individual after he or she had matured and developed a livelihood. In reality, the names would have reflected the ideas in the minds of the parents at the time of the child's birth, not his or her later life. Now, Jabal, Yaval, meaning unknown. Now, I know there's a lot of conjecture about what it might mean and what it might mean, and people have a lot of fun doing that, but that's not the issue here. But he did, living in tents. He apparently lived a somewhat nomadic lifestyle, living in tents, but he is given credit for developing formal systems for domesticating and commercially producing cattle, what modern humans now call livestock: camels, donkeys, cows, goats, sheep, horses, etc., etc. And you note the words of such as have are italicized in the KJV. This is because the word for cattle is not the normal word behemah, from which we also get behemoth. And keep in mind, when Job mentions behemoth as this giant animal, he uses the plural form behemoth. It's like a what we call a plural of majesty, a plural of greatness, a plural indicating greatness of this animal. And yet he's not talking about multiple behemoths. He's talking about one, and the verbs are singular. So that tells you that that is more of what we call a plural of majesty or greatness. But here, the behemoth would be the normal word for cattle. Animals that like to graze in fields and eat grasses and things like that. But the word would have been behemoth. Here it is mikneh, and it is from the verb kana. You can see the QNH in the word mikneh. And so kana. And what kana means, it's a basic verb to get something, to acquire something. And the derived meaning, mikneh, then is cattle, but cattle especially as purchasable domestic animals. Jabal became a possessor of herds or flocks of cattle, which could be purchased by others. Apparently, this is what happened. Perhaps, and think about it, why would they want them? For food, for skins, for milk, burden bearing, etc. Now, this business may have developed from his knowledge of God's intention for Cain to offer an animal sacrifice. He would know what his great-great-great-great-grandfather Cain did. And they all knew that Cain is not going to represent God accurately. He's going to represent himself accurately, contrary to God. And that's what leads people into sin. So the business may have developed from his knowledge of God's intention for Cain to offer an animal sacrifice, even though Cain was a tiller of the soil. So think about it. An acceptable offering was at the very opening of Cain's dwelling. That's what the scripture says. It was right at the door, and it was not crouching, waiting to pounce upon him. The Hebrew word that says it was lying at the door is a word that means it was lying in repose. It was laid back. It was comfortable, right where it wanted to be. And it wasn't fearing what Cain would do to it. And it was lying right at the door, and he would not offer it. But he could have purchased, or could have received one as a gift, who knows, a suitable animal from Abel in order to fulfill God's design. But you know what? He wouldn't. He would not. He was not going to offer the sacrifice, the offering that God had specified, the offering that was good in God's design. He wanted to offer what he wanted to offer. And that is the essence of violation. Now, Jubal, again, the name is unknown as to exactly what it refers to, but apparently developed some kind of aesthetic rather than commercial interest and he developed the stringed and wind instruments, the stringed harp or kinnor, the wind instruments, and ugav, could have been a reed pipe or flute, something like that. Maybe a panpipe, difficult to say just what it was, but some kind of an instrument for making music, if you will. Tubal-Cain was first in his own area of expertise. He developed the field of metalworking. Now, just a word to let you know too, that some scholars think this, and this may be valid. The verb translated instructor carries the basic meaning to sharpen, to hammer, to whet, as in sharpening a sword or a plow. And so the participle here may signify then hammerer. So an instructor, you see, it's like if you're hammering on a piece of metal to shape it, you are instructing that metal what it is to do. So probably not that he was just teaching people, but as he does this, and he does it successfully, he is going to be passing the knowledge down to others as well. Now, note also that the Hebrew word Cain, from which came the name Cain, may be derived from two sources. It could be from the concept of getting or acquiring something, or forging, hammering, shaping something. And if you realize that those two meanings, to get or acquire, when you're talking about a child and you're going to name a child something like this, they are not very far apart in meaning. Because if you're going to get or acquire a child, that means someone is going to forge or hammer or shape that child in some way. So the meanings are not greatly different. They could be very closely related. And now in some lexicons and in Brown, Driver, and Briggs, they will often say that these are two homonyms. They're pronounced the same way, but they actually are two very different meanings. And Brown, Driver, and Briggs separates some of these things like that. But when you go to some of the other lexicons, you find they do not need to be separated and should never have been separated. That tells you Brown, Driver, and Briggs did not get a lot of stuff right, because they were also JEDP believers. So as they indicate in their lexicon very, very widely. So the words translated artificer is a cal participle active, which means to cut in, to plow, to engrave. That is, things for cutting, as artificers in metalworking use various cutting instruments to engrave their work. Thus, Tubal-Cain, this is what it seems like, was hammering all kinds of cutting things in brass and iron. And you can see that the K and D there, that's Kyle and Dalish. That's one idea that they have there. And it makes sense that he was forging, hammering things into shape so that they could be used as instruments for other purposes. And so as such, he was the instructor of others who desired to do this type of work. And the sister's name, Naamah, it does mean basically pleasant, lovely, graceful, but that name could have been put on her as soon as she was born. You don't have to wait until later to find out if she grows up to be a pretty girl or a nice girl to put that on her. Now, look at the next verses here. This is where one of the places I was really wanting to get to. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding. And I'm not going to go through all the Hebrew text here at the moment. And a young man to my hurt. And he says, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So let's go down and think about this just a little bit here. So Lamech's character is revealed by this song, as it's called, he composed. It's the first recorded poem as far as most people think. Now, quite honestly, we've already talked about this. You'll see this idea that this is the first recorded poem, the first recorded song, and it is not the first recorded example of ancient Hebrew or Adamite parallelism. The first example exists in Genesis 1, verse 2, and is very, very, very clear in Genesis 1, verse 27. And that tells us that this parallelistic way of writing to communicate information was not something that was developed by humans. It is not a human development. It was built into the first man by the God who created him. So his character, Lamech's character, is revealed by this song that he composed. He appears to have been boasting, notice, to his two wives only, and we'll see something about that in a minute, of his abilities, maybe in combat, or his determination to take mortal vengeance upon anyone who opposes him. He may have had the advantage of metal weapons forged by his son Tubal-Cain. Lamech's boast about having slain, notice, same thing Cain did to Abel, a man, that is an ish, an individual, for wounding him, and a young man, the word literally is a child, a yeled, for bruising, hurting him, appears to be more than just a statement of something he has done. His boasting in this regard represents an attitude that he would take personal vengeance upon anyone who injured him in any way. His boast is clearly against God too. Obviously, he was well aware of God's warning to anyone who might slay Cain for his murder of Abel. However, now here's Lamech. With no word from God, he pronounces his own warning, a greatly multiplied vengeance upon whoever might slay him. Apparently a vengeance which would be carried out by his family. There is no hint of dependence upon God, but rather an independence of him. Lamech's ungodly boast would have been in Christ's mind, though its ungodliness was not his motivation. For what he said to Peter about forgiveness, when he said, you don't forgive, not 7 or 70 and 7, but 70 times 7. So he took it far beyond. And you got to remember, these people, Peter and the other Hebrews of his day, they would have known these verses, these first chapters of Genesis very well. So now there's an interesting note that I also found and thought about this. It's interesting to me that by the time of the flood, all remaining descendants of both Adam and Cain, keep in mind, even Methuselah died before the flood came. So all remaining descendants of both Adam and Cain, except 8, were essentially wicked. They had gone the wrong way, and they would not get on the ark either. They did not believe God. That's almost incredible to think that all remaining descendants of both Adam and Cain, except 8, were wicked. Most had followed the way of Cain, and that's in Jude 1:11. Their wickedness was great in the earth. No human agency existed. Think about this. No human agency existed to enforce any standards of behavior or worship, and thus humans did. Hey, I thought this was not down till the time of Judges. Humans did whatever was right in their own eyes, and whatever their strength and skills enabled them to do. Keep this in mind, such a situation warranted the Creator's wiping, and that's the word that he used, macha. It warranted the Creator's wiping the face of the earth so they would no longer exist. Yes. What? Okay. All right. Coming that way. I will have to go. Let's see here. What do I have here? Okay. Let me do this. Now, so one commentator's suggestion regarding the boast of Lamech, and think about, and this is possible, In the environment apart from living to the face of God, the increasing sexual laxity stated in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and implied in Matthew 24:28, makes it conceivable that other men were trying to seduce Lamech's wives or take them by force. This may explain his limited audience. So why he only expressed it to his wives. Becca, could you take this for a little bit and maybe go down through? We got a little bit more down below here. Would you be able to do that?
I can. I'm not sure how I could take control of the screen, though.
Oh.
Could you perhaps send the document to me and then I can share it from my end?
I think I can do that. Let's see, just have to figure out which that's 14:26. See if I can do it without. A new email to Miller Kid. Oh, keyboard's halfway under there. You can touch it right now. There.
All right.
Are you here?
Yeah.
And she's backing up to the grass.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Okay.
Did you get it?
Let me see here. It is there. Okay. And so I will go ahead and I will open it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Enable editing. Now let me go ahead and go to text width. And we're down on page.
Okay. I'm not seeing it yet.
No, I haven't shared it just yet.
Okay.
I'm getting down to the proper page first.
Down to page 6.
Yeah. All right. There we go. I got it. Now let me come back over here to, and now I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop. And, okay. All right.
Okay.
All right. Very good, sir.
All right. It says my desktop's still visible to others. I'm going to stop sharing mine totally.
All right.
Okay.
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 All right. Very good.
All right. Very good. You all excuse me. I'll be back in just a couple minutes.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. So we have then where we are seeing the relationship between the descendants of Cain and the Lord, where very clearly there is that alienation. Now, in contrast to that, we are being shown in the final verses here of chapter 4, the relationship between Seth's descendants and the Lord as well. So back home in Eden, the relationship between Adam's descendants and God stood in stark contrast to the lack of a relationship between Cain's descendants and God. God was working to ensure the fulfillment of his promise of a redeemer, the seed of the woman. And that is the promise, of course, that he made to Adam and Eve there in the garden, where he said, "He shall bruise thy heel, but thou shalt bruise his head." So here we have then, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also, there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. And you can see the literal translation there of that particular clause. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. That literal translation there would actually be, then was caused to be common to call in the name of the Lord. So at this point then, during the lifetime of Enos, then we see calling in the name of Yahweh was common. Individuals were doing that. The name Seth or Sheth has the idea of to set, and so thus means appointed or substituted, indicating Eve's faith that through this seed, God would eventually fulfill his promise. So Eve recognized that with that alienation that was existing in between Cain and the Lord, and then also between Cain's descendants and the Lord as well, the Lord would not be using that line to bring into existence his promise of that Savior. But through this seed, through Sheth, there would be that fulfillment. Sheth too had a son, and the name of that son signifies something of what was going on in Sheth's life. He named him Enosh. And Enosh, there are in Hebrew 4 different words for man. One would be Adam, which would be man as a race. Then you have Ish, which is man as an individual. Gever, referring to man and his strength. And then you also have Enosh, the very same word that we have here, which refers to man in his weakness. So Sheth named him Enosh, a name which comes from a Hebrew verb which means to be weak, frail, sick. From this verb also came one of the words for man, the name and the word for man, referring to his weak, frail aspect. And so thus, man in his weakness, this would indicate then the dependence and the need for God. Thus, Sheth gave his son a name which would remind him of his weakness and frailty, of his dependence upon and need of God. It's interesting to note that the name of Sheth was selected by his mother, but the name of Sheth's son was chosen by Sheth the father. Apparently, husbands and wives consulted with one another. And so it would make perfect sense with the man and the woman being one flesh, that both of them would be involved in the naming of the child as well. So then, coming on back to this interesting clause here, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord, which literally then the calling in the name of Yahweh was caused to be common. So, literal idea here, then he was caused to begin to call upon the name of the Lord. It seems here that for some reason, God's immediate presence was no longer accessible, as it had been to Cain and Abel. So there was evidently a little bit of a distinction in the way that the Lord was manifesting himself. Obviously, however, Enosh and other faithful men began to call upon God by name. Perhaps the Cainites were beginning to develop the worship of other things, other gods. One of the things to notice as well, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but the significance of a name. So when we're talking about a name, that idea, that name takes in all that a person is. And so as a result, then, when we have these individuals and they are calling upon God by his name, by the name by which he had revealed himself, they are then, it is that demonstration of that personal relationship, interacting with him personally as who it is that he has revealed himself, instead of stepping back and referring to him as a title. So there is more of that idea of an unalienated relationship here. And also it's possible he has here perhaps the Canaanites were beginning to develop the worship of other things, other gods. Well, if that is what is going on, then the calling of the Creator, the God who exists by his name, that would in fact indicate that distinction that would be involved there. So the distinction between the God who exists and the gods, the works of men's hands. Doubtless, Satan helped the Canaanites to recognize the powers active in God's creation, and then encouraged them to a worship of these powers. We have from other teachings within Scripture where we recognize that behind these pagan gods, there was in fact a power, an anti-God power. And so what they were worshiping then was actually these anti-God angelic beings. As the Canaanites went farther from God and farther from his teachings, it became only natural that they began to subjugate themselves to powers which were godlike to them. Thus, they certainly began to apply names to their new gods. This made it necessary for the Adamites to distinguish their God, the only true one, from the false gods of the Canaanites. And this might indicate as well the beginning of public worship and prayer. So thus what we have in this, there is very clearly this contrast of the anti-God line of Cain and then the godly line of Sheth as well. Of the Canaanites, we read about human accomplishments and boasting. Of the Adamites, we read about faith in God and calling upon the name of the Lord. Kind of an interesting contrast to think about. And then we look at today's society where we see a lot of this boasting in the human accomplishments. But the Lord has said that there is only one valid ground for boasting, and that is knowing him as he has revealed himself. And so that then brings us to the end of this particular document. And so let me see. Let me try this. Okay, I know. Here, this is another document related to that name, that idea of the Lord's name and its significance, especially as it comes on down here. So coming on back down, page 3 here. And so basically this idea is Ehya, Yihya, that would have been the Lord's name of himself from the beginning. No human being gave him that name. No human being had the authority to name the creator of all that exists. So this was a name that the Lord had given to himself, and as a result, he then indicated his what it was that he wanted his creation to focus on with knowing here. The Creator foreknew all that his human creations would do in the future, and in his perfect, timeless pre-creation existence, he had made provision for it all. He foreknew that humans would reject him and his design, seeking to devise a god or gods who better fit their finite sensibilities and limited concepts of who and what God should be. Creating God in their own image, how they wanted him to be. And he knew that humans would need an accurate means of distinguishing between him and all other so-called gods. Humans would need to know him as he actually existed, not as they perceived or wished him to be. And that knowledge would be rooted in his pre-creation existence, an existence perfectly reflected by his own perfect name for himself. He was and is the God who exists, and no better means of distinguishing him from all other so-called gods, gods which did not and do not actually exist, could ever be devised. His name expressed him perfectly and completely. Remember that name Ehya, Yihya, comes from the Hebrew verb haya, which means to exist. Ehya would literally have the idea of I am existing. And so that would be what God would call himself. Yihya, he is existing, would be what humans would refer to him as, because of course they would not say I am existing and thus say, oh, well, I'm calling myself God. That would not do. So thus, he is existing. But then, coming on down a little bit further, and so that was the focus then that we had there. So, thus, the name Ehya has been known to humans from the beginning of human existence. It is not a product of human ingenuity. Humans did not develop it. The Creator himself gave that name to himself. Adam recognized the person and nature of God as no other human has known him, accurately perceiving his own existence as a created being existing within the perfect being of the Creator, the God who existed transcendent to the entirety of the creation. The man understood not only his own personal relationship to God, but also God's relationship to the entirety of creation. The creation did not exist apart from the Creator. The creation existed inseparably within the existence of the Creator. Nothing existed apart from or outside of him. His person was the very definition and identity of existence. And so, thus we have then Ehya, Yihya, was known from the beginning to Adam, but after Adam, the alienation between God and humans, an alienation which had come into existence when Adam violated and which grew as humans continued in their violations, resulted in a greatly diminished use of the name. So you think about what happens. Adam violates. Other humans after him, they continue to violate and continue in that violation. And as they are violating the design of God, they are recognizing, you know, when I do this, I am violating the very person of my Creator. And so as a result, there is this tendency then, this increasing sense of alienation between these humans who are violating the design of God and the person of God. And so as a result, what do we do when we are alienated from someone? We have a tendency to not want to even acknowledge their presence or acknowledge anything that would remind us of them. And so as a result, what happens? The name Yihya, which is the perfect name which takes in all of his person, that name therefore falls into disuse. And so after Adam, the violation between God and humans, an alienation which had come into existence when Adam violated and which grew as humans continued in their violations, resulted in a greatly diminished use of the name Yihya. Its perfect representation of the God who existed was not something of which violating humans wanted to be reminded. Humans had usurped to themselves an authority never get delegated to them by the Creator, though he was the only source of valid authority. And the name Yahweh reminded them of their relationship and accountability to him, their Creator. The name was too distinctive, too exalting. It separated him, the God who exists, unmistakably and unequivocally from any other being or entity they might choose to revere as God for themselves and their own purposes. Their alienation from him made the name too convicting, arousing within them an uncomfortable and undesirable, but inescapable, sense of guilt. For those who sought escape from the Creator and his authority, their only acceptable course of action was to live as though the God who exists does not exist. But for those of Adam's descendants who sought to walk with him in his way, Yahweh was a perfect way of referring to him, and their knowledge and understanding of his name would never diminish. To them, he was the God, the only God who actually exists, and no one could improve upon Adam's perfect name for him. The Creator was and is the God who exists. So you have then this increasing sense of alienation, and so some people are going to say, well, we're not going to use that name. But there are going to be others who will say, no, God exists, we will use the name. And so as a result, then, unalienated men began to use the name again after the birth of Enos, and that's what we saw there. Thus, when Adam, at the end of his document, wrote regarding the birth of Seth, and then the birth of Enos to Seth, he concluded with a specific statement about man's use of the name Yahweh. An obvious recognition of a prior general refusal of humans to acknowledge God as he had revealed himself, Adam stated that, apparently coinciding with the birth of Enos, then was begun the calling in the name Yahweh. The effects of the Cain-Abel disaster and God's gracious treatment of Cain, despite his rejection and rebellion, may have influenced others to restrain their use of the name. Then, with the birth of Enos, with that statement of, wait a minute, I am weak, I am frail, I am therefore dependent upon God. So with that recognition then, perhaps because of its unmistakable and incomprehensible expression of the Creator and his design, something changed in those who sought in their lives to represent the Creator accurately. And they knew that an accurate representation could only rest upon the foundation of his person as he actually is, the person so accurately conveyed in his name, Yahweh, the God who exists. And so thus, that continuation then and resumption of the use of the name of Yahweh. And then we come into after the flood there, but that just is a little bit of a further indication as to what that idea of then began people to call in the name of the Lord, what that was in fact indicating there. It's just that recognition of, no, wait a minute, we are still dependent upon God, and thus we're going to interact with him as he has revealed himself. And then, let's see. And then he was wanting to go into Methuselah as well. So let's see. All right. So as we get on down then into the generations there in Genesis. So we had here, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And that right there is basically Adam's signature, indicating that those first 4 books were written, those first 4 chapters were written by him. And then there's going to be a little bit of a change in the grammar there, indicating a break. And this then would be where Shaith picked up. So in the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth. And then to Seth as well, we have Enos born. And then to Enos, we have Canaan. And then to Canaan as well, we come on down to Mahalaleel. And then to Mahalaleel, we have Yareth. And then we have Hanok. And then to Hanok as well, we're going to have Methuselah. And that right there is when we're going to pick up with this particular paper. So Methuselah. And so when we begin our study of this, again, recognizing that we begin our study with the fact that the Lord, the creator of all that exists, he is the foundation. And so as a result, then we are looking at this to see who he is. So what we have then, as the transcendent creator of all that exists, the Lord God is owner, designer, determiner, definer, sustainer, and absolute authority of every aspect of the creation. He made the creation perfect. He designed Adam and Eve, and they were, in fact, the perfect expression, the absolute best of his creative ability. And then we come on down into this idea of Methuselah. And Methuselah, he is famous because of his very long life, 969 years. But considering as well what else we know about Methuselah, and that would indeed be his walk with God. So the Creator introduced the man Methuselah, in the genealogy of Genesis 5. Identifying there his father and his son as well. In this genealogical context, God also gave the ages of these men, the greatest of which was the 969-year life of Methuselah. Though unnamed, others in that same era may have lived even longer lives. The man Methuselah is often remembered primarily and sometimes exclusively as the longest living man of that time. The length of his life, however, is a simple statement of fact and was never intended to be that for which he is famous. Because remember, as we were seeing there with that contrast between Cain's descendants and Seth's descendants, Cain's descendants were focused on their human achievements. But what we have with Seth's line was that focus on their relationship with the Lord. And that is to be where the focus is, not on this year, the length of life, because as our Lord said, how many of us by worrying can add a year to our life? But rather it's, did this person know the Lord? So indeed, many humans are famous, but their fame is in the eyes of other humans. And they are accorded that fame despite the fact that their lives are the very epitome of selfish and destructive attitudes, of totally ungodly perspectives. And it is established by the great bulk of humankind that measures fame in those attributes which have no lasting value and often are in total contrast to the design of God for human existence. Thus, being famous is a quality measured by people who do not know or do not seek to live by the design of God, and it is measured according to criteria which are completely contrary to God's person. Clearly, fame is inconsequential to all that truly matters. For any human, the true measure of character is godliness. That is, causing absolute firmness to the Creator and his design. And this must be the criterion by which Methuselah or any human is measured. This is the criterion which must be proclaimed as God intended, in order that all who hear might see their need of conforming their own lives, regardless of age, to the perfect design criteria of the Creator, just as Methuselah did. And would you like for me to hand it back over to you, sir?
If you don't mind, my throat's dry now. Would you continue down through that next part there, please?
Certainly, I can do that. Many have not
Unless-
recognized.
Stephen's there. We could have Stephen read too, or one of the others there can read.
Certainly,
Can we do that?
certainly, that sounds good.
It's no problem. You want me to pick up with that section?
Yes, please.
Okay. Many have not recognized the fact of Methuselah's godliness. Many, however, never having been exposed to any valid development of the biblical text regarding Methuselah, question the godliness of this man and its implications for the life of believers. The first question often encountered relates to whether or not Methuselah was a believer. With no direct statement of Scripture in this regard, the question is valid. Humans, however, tend to evaluate whatever matter is at hand according to the information available to their senses, without involving themselves in any degree of more intensive study. Thus, finding Methuselah mentioned only in texts which record genealogical relationships, their primary resource for evaluating his godliness is their knowledge and experience in modern Christian parenting, with its obvious ineffectiveness at conveying the person of God and his design from one generation to another. This kind of thinking is the basis for a question posed by a pastor who was planning to preach about Methuselah and questioned the proposition that this ancient man was indeed a believer. Are you basing your conclusion regarding Methuselah's godliness on the fact that he had a godly parent? If so, don't children make their own decisions even when they have the godliest of parents? Every day, children refuse to accept Christ even when they are raised by the godliest of parents. Is there any more clarification you can give me on this statement? I am sending you my message for Sunday, and you can see my line of reasoning. This same pastor followed with an additional question regarding a description of Methuselah as a pre-flood preacher of righteousness, just as Noah was. You indicated that Methuselah was the 8th pre-flood patriarch who preached to the wicked world of his day. Where do you see that? I am not trying to be ugly, but I don't see where you found the evidence for that deduction. The Bible never says that Methuselah did anything. Am I missing something? If you have time to answer before tomorrow, that's great. If not, I would still love to hear your wisdom on this subject. I am preaching to my church on little-known Old Testament characters. If you have any related materials, I would love to receive them. Though both of these are valid questions, this pastor, just as so many others, was indeed missing something, but his willingness to learn, if willing to receive instruction, is a true asset.
Very good.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yes.
And so I had the blessing of being able to respond to that.
You'll have to share that.
If you will, let's cover. Let me see this next part here. I got it on my machine too.
Okay.
And by the way, that pastor who asked the questions and I have a very good relationship. So I don't mind questions. I just don't want to waste time on people who aren't willing to learn. So yeah, I guess since we're past 4:30 a little bit. If we just read through the English text there
Sure.
regarding Methuselah, and there is one other place. It's in First Chronicles chapter 1 verse 3, but there it just says he's the son of Enoch. That's all it says there. So there are only 6 places. But so you want to read through the text, Becca,
Sure.
or you can ask someone else to do it too if you want. It's up to
Sure.
you.
Mrs. Carter, would you read?
Yes.
Thank
God's record regarding Methuselah. The primary scripture record of Methuselah is the genealogical record of Genesis 5, which contains 5 of the 6 occurrences of his name. This text reads, and Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And the days of Methuselah was 969 years, and he died.
You know, that what follows immediately after that, if you don't mind, let's just take just a couple of moments beyond this, because we're not going to go through all the text of those sections. I don't have any voice. I don't know why.
Do you want me to continue?
Sure, that'd be good, if you don't mind.
All right. The years of Methuselah's origin and life and history. Methuselah was the 8th patriarch of the 1,652 years prior to the Noah flood. The son of Enoch, Hebrew, how would I say that?
Hanok.
Hanok, dedicated. The father Lamech, the man who would father Noah. He was born in the year 684 absolute, 3,482 BC, and died in the year 1652 absolute, 2,514 BC, the year of the flood. Methuselah was also the grandfather of Noah, and Noah was born in 1052, 3,114 BC, when Methuselah was 369 years of age. And Noah lived with his grandfather, Methuselah, for 600 years.
Now what we would think of typically, well, these are just numbers. But keep in mind, these are numbers that are in the scriptures. And God never gives numbers or any scripture of any kind that is not significant. It has great significance. And what we usually do is we read the numbers and we go, wow, he lived 969 years. Oh boy, wow. Poof. Well, that's our problem. So, want to do another paragraph or two there?
Yeah. So, okay, why don't we, let's see, Brother Phillips, are you there, please? Okay, looks like he
May not be there.
stepped away for a moment. See, Brother Tucker.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, would you read the unquestionable godliness, please?
fact that Methuselah was named by his father, Enoch, is of great significance. Because, as God recorded of him, Enoch was a man who made himself walk with God. Certainly, Enoch's making himself walk with God existed well before the birth of Methuselah and continued for the 300 years he lived after he begat Methuselah. The Creator's description of Enoch's walk with him indicates that this man's walk was singular in his generation. That is, his walk with God was distinctive among those of his day. Unlike all the other patriarchs and men of the era, Enoch did not die a physical death, but at at the then very young age of 365, God took him, as though Enoch went for a walk with God, and then, because the fellowship between the man and his Creator was so unfettered by violation that Enoch continued walking with God and simply did not come home. Such was the walk of the father of Methuselah for the 300 years that the two men walked together.
Hmm.
So you can imagine.
Is Andres there?
He's not here today,
Okay.
but don't know. Maybe Brother Gettle would. Read or
Do that.
all right. Would you pick up with the influence, please?
The record makes it clear that Enoch was a very godly man, even receiving prophetic revelation from God regarding the Lord's coming over 600 years before the Noahic flood and over 3,000 years before Jude referenced his prophecy in the New Testament. In Jude 1:14 and 15, Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Enoch's influence on Methuselah cannot have been anything but a direct reflection of his own close walk with the Creator, and, considering the 300 years father and son shared life together, that influence must have been profound. The combined testimony of his father and his ancestors, including Adam, developed in Methuselah an unquestioning confidence not only in God's existence and authority, but also in the necessity of walking in his design. Methuselah was a contemporary of Adam for 246 years, Seth for 358 years, Enos for 455 years, Canaan for 549 years, Mahalalel for 604 years, and his grandfather Yared for 735 years.
And so thus we can see that influence there. And Brother Gilbert, would you pick up with Enoch's reason, please?
Enoch's, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Enoch's reason for naming his son Methuselah. Methuselah's very name speaks of his father's intention to convey his own faith to his son. As a man who knew and walked with God, Enoch recognized the condition of the world around him, and he knew that the Creator would call mankind into account for the rebellion that was already rampant nearly 1,000 years before the flood. Walking with the Creator and communicating with him, Enoch could not miss the fact that the Lord God would do what was necessary to demonstrate to man the incredibly disastrous nature of rejecting his design. God would evaluate the situation perfectly, and he would act in accord with his perfect evaluation. Every aspect would be accomplished
in the absolute best manner, because the Creator would do it. Though still less than 65 years of age, Enoch saw about him things that would have moved him to wonder how much longer God would bear with man's rebellion. And his natural response would have been to ask the only one who knew the answer, Yeh, the Lord, the God with whom he walked.
And then let's see. Brother Jeff or Heather, are either one of you available?
I'm here.
All right. Would you please read Enoch's construction, please?
Enoch's construction of the name Methuselah and its meaning. Obviously, the Lord recognized Enoch's burdened heart and his great faith and deemed him worthy of a specific answer to his question. Enoch believed that answer and named his son Methuselah, a name that literally means when the dying of him occurs, he has sent judgment. This meaning is a direct rendering of the two parts of the Hebrew name. The first part, Methu, is simply a name modification of motho, a composite of the Hebrew verb infinitive moth, dying, and the pronominal suffix o, him. The construction carries a temporal time sense and might thus be translated in the time of the dying of him, or when he dies. The second part, Salah, is Shalach, in the pausal form of Shalak in its first occurrence. This word, like the first part of Methuselah's name, is a name modification of the vowels of the finite Hebrew verb Shalak, Hal perfect third masculine singular, which would be translated he sent or he has sent. The entire composite could thus be translated when he dies, he has sent, where the first he refers to Methuselah and the second he refers to God. The perfect aspect of Shalak is significant here in that it signifies completed action, thereby indicating that Enoch recognized that God had already established the fact that a judgment on erring humankind would occur, a judgment which could not be turned aside, though it was over 1,000 years in the future.
The message of Methuselah's name and his role as preacher of righteousness. Enoch knew and conveyed it to his son in the name he gave to him, that God's judgment would follow just after the dying of Methuselah. Thus, Methuselah's name and his message were one and the same. And he carried this message upon himself for 969 years as he, like his father, saw the worsening of man's rebellion. The effects molded Methuselah into the seventh of the 8 pre-flood preachers of righteousness, the last of which was Noah. Though he was undoubtedly a godly man, Lamech, Noah's father, never received the title the preacher of righteousness, because his father Methuselah outlived him by 5 years. Without question, Methuselah received the revelation of God communicated to him by his father and others, and he himself also walked with God.
I guess we probably ought to stop there. Do you think?
I think so. I think that's good.
Because we go into the confusion and error of modern lexicons. That's, the man of the dart. Oh boy. Anyway. Or the man of the spear, the javelin or something. It's amazing the stuff they can come up with. So, okay. Okay, if nothing else, I guess we could,
All right.
any comments or any thoughts by anybody before we close up?
Speaking of amazing what they can come up with, we just heard for the first time this morning in Sunday school that Giants, the Hebrew word can be translated tyrants in Genesis 6.
Could be translated what?
Tyrants. There were tyrants in the land.
Tyrants.
Tyrant.
I didn't see
Yeah.
that anywhere possible with the word Nephal of Nephilim.
No, it's not. It'd be interesting to know who came up with that. I don't think I've seen that, but I know they think there are people that say, well, that's a derived concept. So I've seen similar things, but I don't think I've seen the word tyrant before. So,
I never heard that.
so, okay. Anything else? Oh, by the way, just to let all of you know, there is a document called, and I thought I had it, but I guess I don't know where it is right at the moment, called the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch does record more, and I'm not saying it's canonical, but it does record a lot more detail regarding these events and some of these things. And even what went on between the father Enoch and the son Methuselah, whether or not it's a true account, I cannot say, but it's yeah, we'll just have to wait for a while to find out whether it's true. So, but okay, anything else, anyone?
Yes. What struck me is that Noah lived with his grandfather, Methuselah, 700 years.
Yeah.
I just, wow, what a testimony.
There is so much like that when you start looking at the numbers, and you know that timeline that I put together, but that's
Yes.
not my timeline. I took it right out of the text, and I'm like you, Vivian. I started seeing some of these things, and I said, "Wow." As a matter of fact, did I put in that other paper about what Shem had written? Did I put that in there, or well, that was in a footnote?
Shem had written this one here.
I missed what Vivian just said. What she said.
I don't think it was in this one.
How long Noah and Methuselah lived together?
Oh,
The father and the grandson.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now I have a note somewhere to the effect of that. Of course, with Adam having begun the record and transferring it to Seth, and then Seth transferring it down, eventually coming to Noah, Methuselah would have been the one who transferred the record to Noah directly, and then Noah would carry it through the flood, and then Shem. And when you begin to look at it and you evaluate who would actually have been writing down these different parts of the record of God, it's kind of amazing to think about, because we think, well, Abraham would have written. Abraham didn't write any of the account. Shem lived 502 years after the flood, and he was still writing. And then when he passes it on, he would pass it to the next oldest patriarch, and that would have been Eber, where we get the word Hebrew from. So, and Eber outlived Abraham and lived down into the time of Isaac and even to the life of Jacob. So before he would have passed it on. So it's really interesting to look at how these lives overlapped and interacted with one another. But I can tell you, I don't have a doubt in my mind that Methuselah was shall we say, an extremely godly individual. How could you, he walked with his father. I mean, here was his father Enoch, who goes for a walk with God and doesn't come home There's no alienation between Enoch and God. And Methuselah walked with his father for 300 years after he was named Methuselah. Could it be he didn't know what the meaning of his name was? Ha! Probably heard it every time he heard somebody say Methuselah, thought of who he was.
So much for languages changing over time.
Mm.
Yeah, the evolutionary mindset, when it's prevalent, that's totally ignored. But when you look at the lifetimes, it's crazy
Yeah.
to believe otherwise. When people live 700-800 years, why would the language have changed? You have grandfathers interact and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So much when you start correlating all the pieces. Anything else? Anyone? Do you have anything, Becca, you want to add in there? Whatever at the present.
I was just thinking as well, not only every time his name was pronounced, but people would also ask him, "That's an interesting name. Why did your parents name you that?"
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you.
So that would be a testimony he would be able to give every moment of his life, really. So, and still men rejected God. Wow. Tells you something about that time in history and the relationship between God and men.
Kind of reminds me of what we see in Revelation. All those things happening during the time of the tribulation, and they still.
Yeah. They want to hide in the caves and they want the rocks to fall on them, but they don't want to accept him, period.
Yeah.
They want to continue in their rejection.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of the time when Noah was building the ark. That was a testimony and evidence, that ark before them building. They could see something's happening, but they still rejected.
Yeah.
Talk about evidence. It's being built right in front of your eyes. Something's going to happen. Something massive is being built right in front of your eyes.
Something like nothing else that had ever been built.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that's true mental illness.
It
Talk
is.
about it now.
Yeah.
I wish you wouldn't talk about that way, Vivian, because that means I have had substantial mental illness in my life.
We all have.
Yes. But okay. Very good. Do you want to stop it or
Stop our recording here.